This is part one of chapter 41, Community Ecology. There are two parts to this lecture. Today we're going to be discussing various terms like habitat, niche, community, symbiotic, competition, predation, parasitism, and mutualism. We're going to be able to list and distinguish among several types of species interactions, discuss the positive aspects and negative aspects of predation on prey populations, list the various types of prey defense against predators, describe how communities are organized, how they develop, and how they diversify, and discuss the concept of ecological succession. So if you've ever been bitten by a fire ant, you know it's awful. Fire ants are actually imported ants. They arrived in the US in the 1930s as a stowaway in a cargo ship, and they have been very successful in the United States. They've spread as far west as California and as far north as Kansas. And when you step on a fire ant hill, you usually will regret it because fire ants have a venomous sting, and what's happening is they're disrupting native wildlife communities and are not easily controlled by pesticides. So fire ants pose a greater threat to indigenous species of wildlife, indigenous meaning those that have been here before the fire ants. And ants feed on various songbird eggs and offspring. They disrupt populations of horned lizards in Texas. And biological controls are now being used to control fire ant populations. And so what scientists have figured out is that there are different types of flies and wasps that can lay their eggs inside the ants' tissues. And so what they're doing is they're releasing these flies into the environment. And the fly's larvae will then eat its way through the ant as it undergoes metamorphosis in its head, killing the ant. So a community is all species that live in a particular region. We're part of a community. We all live in Southeast Louisiana, and we interact with those around us. The type of place where a species normally lives is its habitat. And all species living in a habitat constitute a community. So think about it. You may live in an apartment, you might live in a house, you might live in a trailer. Those would be your habitats. And then in the greater scheme of things, you live in the community of Thibodaux or Houma or other regions of Southeast Louisiana. So communities often are nested one inside another, and a habitat is a type of environment in which a species typically lives. So here's an example of communities that are often nested in each other. Here we have a forest. And within that forest are logs that have fallen and started to rot. And within those logs are termites. And those termites are going to be eating that log. And inside that termite is a bunch of microorganisms. And those microorganisms allow the termite to digest the food. So here we have a community structure with our forest. And within our forest, our fallen log. And within our fallen log, the termite. And within the termite, the microorganisms. Communities differ in their species diversity. So species diversity has two components. It's species richness, which is the number of species, and species evenness, or relative abundance of each species. And community structure is very dynamic, which means that it's always changing. So here we have two examples. Here we're looking at species richness, which is the number of species. So here you see that there are 4 different types of trees. And then species evenness is the relative abundance. So here we see that there's a whole lot more of tree A than there is of trees B, C, and D. But community structure can change as the community forms and ages. And this could be as a result of human-induced disturbances. For example, maybe it's around the holidays and people want to cut down all the Christmas trees. It can also occur due to changes in physical factors such as climate or resource availability, like a drought or a fire. And also could be due to various types of species interactions. So more animals move into that prefer the dominant tree. So here we have a bunch of species evenness, but then over time we see that species A begins to dominate. Symbiosis is the idea of living together. It refers to a relationship in which two species have a prolonged close association. Two species that interact closely for generations can co-evolve, an evolutionary process in which each species acts as a selective agent on the other. So symbiosis is one species lives in or on another in a commensal, mutualistic, or parasitic relationship. And here's a great example. Here we have a hippopotamus and we have a bird. And this bird's job is basically to hang out with this hippopotamus all day and eat all the bugs that might land on the hippo. Now, this is a mutualistic relationship because the bird is getting dinner and the hippo is getting relieved of any bugs that might be trying to bite its skin or suck its blood. Species interaction can be mutually beneficial, mutually harmful, or benefit one species while harming the other. An example would be this commensal fern. This fern will attach to the trunk of a tree, and the fern benefits from the light, and the tree is completely unaffected. So basically, the fern is no longer on the forest floor, so it can get some light. Commensalism is a species interaction that benefits one species and neither helps nor harms the other. Here's a great chart to kind of help you out with this stuff. So commensalism is a type of symbiotic reaction in which one species is going to be helped, in this case the fern, but the other species, in the case of the tree, is not harmed. Mutualism is when both organisms get helped. And then interspecific competition, predation, and herbivory, both species will be harmed. And parasitism is when one species will, and predation is when one species will win and the other species will be harmed. So key concepts. A community consists of all species in a habitat, and a habitat's history, its biological and physical characteristics and interactions among species in the habitat affect the number of species in the community and their relative abundance. So let's talk about these relationships. Let's talk about mutualism. Mutualistic interaction, two species benefit by taking advantage of one another. For example, here we see this monarch butterfly, and it is eating nectar from this flower. While it's eating nectar from its flower, it's collecting pollen on its legs. So as it hops from flower to flower, it is going to be getting a meal, and those flowers are going to be fertilized by pollen. So this is a species interaction that benefits both species. Another one, and there's a great cheesy video to illustrate this concept, is the yucca plant and the yucca moth. So in some mutualistic relationships, neither species can complete its life cycle without the other. So here, the moth matures when the flowers bloom. So the mouth parts of the female moth are specialized to collect yucca pollen, and the female flies to another flower. It pierces its ovary and lays eggs inside of it, fertilizing the yucca as she leaves. So she's going to lay her eggs inside of a plant as well as fertilize that plant. Now, as that plant grows and matures and makes seeds, it will also allow for her larvae to grow and mature and eventually leave the plant. Another mutualistic relationship is mutualism and defense. If you've ever watched Finding Nemo, you're very familiar with sea anemone as sea anemone fish. Here, an enemy fish has mucus layer that shields it from the stinging cells of the sea anemone. The tentacles of the sea anemone are going to protect the fish from any predators, and the fish is going to protect the sea anemone from any predators that can actually eat the sea anemone tentacles. Another mutualistic relationship is mutualistic microorganisms. Mutualistic microorganisms helps plants obtain nutrients. One example is this bacteria that hang out by the roots of pea plants, and what it does is it fixes nitrogen so the plant can get nitrogen. Other microorganisms like fungi can actually live on the roots of plants and enhance the plant's mineral uptake by increasing the root surface area. And other fungi can interact with photosynthetic algae or bacteria in lichen. Competitive interactions. Resources are limited, and individuals of different species often compete for access to these resources. This is called interspecific competition. So this is competition between two species, not nearly as fierce as the same species competition. Every organism has an ecological niche. This is defined by a physical and biological factor. The more similar the niches of the two species are, the more intensely they will compete. So think about it. If everyone requires the exact same resources, then the competition will become more heated. An animal's niche includes the temperature range it can tolerate, the species it eats, the places it can breed. For example, flowering plant's niche would include its soil, water, light, and pollinator requirements. So an ecological niche is all of a species' requirements and roles in an ecosystem. There's two types of interspecific competition. One is exploitative competition and the other is interference competition. Exploitative competition is when two species reduce the amount of resources available to the other by using that resource. For example, if you have a tree that produces a lot of acorns and a deer goes into your backyard and eats all those acorns, it is not going, that's competing against the blue jay who also needs those acorns. So that's exploitative competition. Interference competition is when one species actively prevents another from accessing the same resource. So that could be a species guarding some water or some food. So exploitative competition is two species reduce the amount of resources available to the other by using those resources up first. The species do not actually have to interact with one another to have this competition. Interference competition is when one species actively prevents another from accessing the same resource. For example, one species of scavenger, like these hyenas, will often chase away another scavenger from a carcass. Species compete most intensely when a shared resource is the main limiting factor for both. So if food is the main limiting factor for them, then that's when competition will be the highest for that factor. Whenever two species require the same limited resource to survive or reproduce, the better competitor will drive the less competitive species to extinction in that habitat. So competitive exclusion is the process whereby two species compete for the same resource and one drives the other to local extinction. Here's an example. Paramecium are single-celled organisms and they live in the bayou. You can see a picture here. And they eat the same food. They eat bacteria. So each species thrives when it's grown alone in a container of bacteria, as you can see here. So these are the two parameciums, and this is their growth curve. However, if you were to grow these two parameciums together in the same container, what you'll see is that this one will outcompete and eat all the food, excluding this one, which will die or become extinct much faster. Other organisms get around this competition by doing resource partitioning. This is an evolutionary process by which species become adapted to use shared limited resources in a way that minimizes competition. For example, different birds are going to live in different parts of a tree. So they might all require that tree for food or shelter, but what they'll do is they'll partition that tree into different levels. And I've got a great picture of that on the next slide. So resource partitioning is the species become adapted in different ways to access different portions of a limited resource. And this allows species with similar needs to coexist. So here's an example of resource partitioning. Here we have a bunch of different birds, and they all require the same type of tree for food and shelter. And what you can see is that these birds have basically evolved in a way to coexist on this tree, but at different levels. Resource partitioning also occurs in plants. Roots of each species take up water and mineral ions from different soil depths. So some plants will evolve to go deeper into the soil and others more shallow, and that's going to reduce competition among the species and allow them to coexist. Directional selection occurs when species with similar requirements share a habitat and compete for a limiting resource, resulting in character displacement. Character displacement is the outcome of competition between two species. Directional selection shifts the range of variation for one of more traits in a direction that lessens the competition for a limiting resource. So here's a great example. If you look at Darwin's finches, over time their beaks have all evolved so that they can eat different things, so that they're not competing against one another. So here we have ones that evolve beaks to eat leaves, others to eat insects, grubs, buds and fruit, and a tool-using finch. Predation and herbivory are short-term interactions in which one species obtains nutrients and energy by feeding on another. So predation is one species, the predator, captures, kills, and eats the other species, the prey. If you're a vegetarian and you never thought that you're a predator, you're a predator of plants. The abundance of prey species in a community affects how many predators it can support. So if you don't have a lot of prey species, you're not going to support a lot of predators. With some predators, such as web-spinning spiders, the proportion of prey killed is constant. Usually, the number of prey killed depends on the time it takes a predator to capture, eat, and digest prey. For example, a wolf that hunts a caribou won't go out hunting again until prey has been completely eaten. Predator and prey populations may rise and fall in cycles. For example, the lynx and the snowshoe hare, which you saw a picture of in a previous slide, rise and fall over a 10-year cycle. So when there's a lot of lynx, obviously there's not going to be as many hares because they're eating them all. And then when the lynx population drops, the hare population will expand. Predator and prey exert selection pressure on one another. Predators exert selection pressure that favors improved prey defenses, and improved prey defenses in turn exert a selection pressure on the predator to improve capture skills, and so on. So here we have the lion, which has gotten faster and faster to keep up with the zebra, but the zebra evolved stripes so that it could hang out with its friends and confuse the lion. Defensive adaptations of prey include hard or sharp parts that make prey difficult to eat, and chemicals that taste bad or sicken predators. Other adaptations include tricking or startling an attacking predator, and a well-defended prey often have warning coloration that predators learn to avoid, such as black and yellow stripes of a stinging wasp or bee. Other defensive adaptations include mimicry. This is when the prey will masquerade as the species that has a defense that they lack. For example, some flies are going to mimic wasps and bees, so that species will stay away from them. So mimicry is when a species evolves traits that make it look more similar in appearance to other species. Predators also adapt. Adaptations include sharp teeth and claws, and also they might also camouflage themselves, allowing them to blend into their surroundings to avoid detection by their prey. With herbivory, the number and types of plants in a community can influence the number of types of herbivores present. So herbivory is a plant that feeds on an animal that feeds on plant parts. There are two types of defenses against herbivores. Some plants have adapted to withstand and recover quickly from herbivory, which means that if a leaf gets ripped off or a stem, it's going to regenerate that very quickly. And then the other is that plants have traits such as spines, tough leaves, or toxins that deter herbivores. If you ever looked at a cactus or a rose bush, and they have spikes. Plants' defenses favor adaptations in herbivores. For example, koalas have a special enzyme to break down toxins in eucalyptus that other organisms can't. Here's a great herbivore defense. In this tree, whenever a caterpillar starts to eat it, a chemical in the saliva is going to signal the plant. The plant is going to synthesize and release an attractant to this wasp. This wasp will then see the caterpillar and lay its eggs inside the caterpillar. And once those eggs start to hatch, it will kill the caterpillar. Other parasites are called brood parasites. And that's when they basically are going to trick other species into providing parental care. Remember the cuckoo bird? With parasitism, one species, the parasite, feeds on another, the host, without immediately killing it. So that's pretty important because you don't want to kill your host right away. You want the parasite to live long enough to reproduce. Endoparasites live and feed on the inside of their host. These would be things like parasitic worms, viruses, and bacteria. And then you have ectoparasites, which feed while attached to the host's external surface. So it'd be like ticks, mites, and lamprey. So parasitism is a relationship in which one species withdraws nutrients from another species without immediately killing it. Parasites include a diverse variety of groups that include fungus, protists, invertebrates, and vertebrates. Lampreys attach to and feed on other fish. This is an ectoparasite. Mistletoe can also basically steal water nutrients from the tree. And then some worms, such as the worms in the stomach, would be endoparasites. Parasites are adaptive traits that allow the parasite to locate hosts and feed undetected. For example, ticks move towards heat and carbon dioxide, which is what we breathe out. Look how tiny they are. Hosts also adapt traits to minimize the negative effects of the parasites. For example, there's a huge population in Africa with sickle cell anemia, which is supposed to protect them from the parasites that are transmitted by mosquitoes. The presence of brood parasites, such as the North American cowbird, decreases the reproductive rate of the host species and favors host individuals to detect and eject foreign young. Brood parasitism has also evolved in some bee species. So brood parasitism is one egg-laying species benefits by having another raise its offspring. It's a great video that's showing birds that are all utilizing the same nest and how they come in and they become brood parasites by trying to kill the other bird's babies. Parasitoids reduce a host population in two ways. Parasitoid larvae withdraw nutrients and prevent the host from reproducing, and the presence of larvae leads to the death of the host. A parasitoid is an insect that lays eggs in another insect and whose young devour their host from their inside out. And again, this is a video showing how that wasp lived. Parasites and parasitoids are commercially raised and released in target areas as biological control agents, an environmentally friendly alternative to pesticides. A biological control agent must be adapted to a specific host species and survive in that species' habitat. Introducing a biological control species into a community is risky. They sometimes go after non-targeted species or get out of control. Here we have an example of biological controls. The citrus industry utilizes the release of ladybird bugs, which controls citrus aphids. Commensalism, mutualism, competition, predation, and parasitism are interspecific interactions. Can you describe each interaction? Can you describe how each individual in the relationship has evolved to make the relationship happen? They influence the population size of participating species, which in turn influences the community stature.